Sweet. Thank you very much, Azra. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. As usual, it's the usual spill, but never too much because we like to hear from you. So if you can, take a moment to let our presenters know how they did on this presentation. We'll probably put the link on the chat box um, so that everybody can just have access to this. But it's always good to hear from you. Our presenters like to hear from you. We do share your feedback. It is completely anonymous, so no worries, no names shared or anything like that. Um, but yes, please let us know how we're doing and let us know what you would like to hear for future presentations so that we can prepare adequately as well. Today's agenda, Environmental Hazardous Materials EMP. We have our environmental review by our EADD team, and we have Jennifer Walton, who is the senior principal engineer. We have a lot of content to cover for this part. We also have on the construction phase our environmental field ops, represented by Catherine McAdams. She'll take care of that part. In the REO's office from LaGuardia, Carmela Sinicolo, and Daniel Pineda. And then we have the questions. Like Azra mentioned, please don't wait till the end. Feel free to type your questions in the chat box. We'll make sure they are read and answered. And if we don't have an answer, we will make sure to get back to you with the appropriate answer as well too. Like I mentioned, a lot of ground to cover. I'm going to stop right here and I'm going to let Jennifer take over and we will see you at the end of the presentation. Jennifer?
Yep, perfect. Thank you so much, Ryan. Next slide. Okay, so the agenda for today, we're going to talk about the hazardous materials process overview from a design perspective. We'll go over the PA 3677 form, and we'll touch a little bit on the PA 3678, and then we'll dive into the environmental management plan and highlight a couple sections for you, and then also just to plug the next webinar, we're going to deep dive into the EMP elements in October to talk about soil management, excavation, fill materials, and dewatering. If you're interested in that, that'll be in October. Next slide. So as Ryan mentioned, my name's Jennifer Wooten. I work in EADD Environmental Group as Senior Principal Engineer. I've been here 6 months as of today. It's my 6-month anniversary. So basically, what does environmental engineering do in our review process for hazardous materials? So what we're looking for, what we're reviewing relates to asbestos, lead, PCBs, and again, I'm the one responsible for looking at the TAAs. Next slide. Basic info. So why are we doing this review? So we want to ensure compliance with federal and state regulations. So the TAAs that we're looking at or what's triggering this review, typically building demolition, a renovation, any kind of internal or external work, underground work, especially if you have fuel or electrical utility work, things like borings or other ground intrusive or site work, those things would all trigger our review. And when do we look at these things? So with the TAA design submission, pre-construction documents, inspection certification package, those are all things that we may touch on. And the types of things we're looking at include drawings, plans, documents, and the forms that we're going to talk about today. Next slide. So what are we reviewing these standards against for hazardous materials? So for asbestos in New York, we're looking at the 12 NYCRR Part 56 code rule, so that's New York State. And in New Jersey, the asbestos regulations are administered through the Department of Community Affairs. And then federally, everything's overseen by the EPA. For lead, we use OSHA's lead in construction standard. Next slide. So when we're looking at an asbestos package, a TAA that has asbestos, either abatement or you're saying you don't have asbestos, this is touching on when you do, we want to know the type of asbestos. So that means, is it friable? Is it non-friable? So friable is something that can be crushed by hand pressure and the fibers are released into the air, something like thermal insulation. Non-friable would be something like a floor tile. We want to know the quantity of asbestos that you need to abate, and we want to know the location, so we need drawings, a floor plan, a building profile. Something like the figure to the right kind of shows you, hey, here's our room, here's where the exhaust unit is going to go, here's where the air comes in, and then it's a little bit hard to see on the bottom there, but that shows you where your decon unit is. You need to know the path of the route for which you're going to take the waste from the work area into the waste container, all the things that are required by the regulations. So we want to know your abatement methods, we want to know the regulatory citations, the engineering controls, all of this shown on your drawing. Next slide. So the 3677 form. On the left here, this is straight out of the TCAP manual. So basically, one thing we want to highlight here, when you have ACM projects that involve caulk, we also want you to look for PCBs. We've had lots of instances where there's high levels of PCB found in caulking. So definitely something you should sample for in addition to asbestos. That's just something to note. On the right, we have the PA 3677 form, and this form was updated in December of 2021. So it's been some time that it's been in use, but you just want to make sure you're using the correct, most up-to-date form when submitting your application. So the best way to check is the date on the upper right-hand corner, but also at the top in part 1, when you're talking about whether or not you have an asbestos project, there's 3 boxes. So the old form, I think, only had 2. But the first one is identifying that, yep, we had a survey done that we're using as part of this project, and it's included, and there's no ACM that's going to be disturbed. The next box is there is no ACM because we're working in a vacant lot. Or the last box is there's no ACM that we know of because the building was built after 1990, and our work, after doing a thorough review of documents, we don't believe we're going to disturb anything. So then the engineer or the architect of record signs the bottom of the form. And if you check the first box where you're using an existing survey, then you need to get the certification from the asbestos handler that they've reviewed the report and that everything is they're in agreement with that. So we need their seal and their name and their license number on that as well. Next slide. So if you have a non-asbestos project, we have these certification letters as examples in the TCAP manual. And basically one is just saying, yep, we had this survey and here it is attached, and this is why we're not disturbing any asbestos. The other letter to the right is an example of when you check the box at the bottom that said, the building was built after 1990. So it's basically saying we had done a thorough review of the design and construction documents, and to the best of our knowledge, there's no ACM present that we're going to be disturbing. So those are 2 examples of the letters we would look for as well. Next slide. So other hazmat concerns, we're talking about asbestos, but also lead paint. So basically we assume all painted surfaces that are existing contain lead, and then we follow the OSHA lead in construction standards. PCBs, as I mentioned, could show up in caulking, but also in electrical equipment. If you have any kind of like cables that are shielded with some kind of insulating oil, sometimes they'll have PCBs in there. Also, fluorescent light fixture ballast at one time contained PCBs. So these items are considered universal waste, and they need to be quantified and managed according to the universal waste regs. Next slide. Our standard notes, which you all may be pretty familiar with for asbestos and lead. So even if you're saying you're not going to disturb asbestos, we like to put these notes onto the drawings just to cover in the event that if you do uncover any ACM, you have the procedures and protocols to follow, working with the REO's office and getting that material sampled and figured out, how much you need to abate and then move forward in that direction. And as I mentioned with lead, we assume that all existing painted surfaces have lead paint, so you should follow the OSHA's lead in construction standard process. Next slide. The 3678 form. So this is when you do have an abatement project. So the TCAP manual highlighted some things, but the main takeaway here, this form will include a summary of information in the application, and certain required information might not be available at the time that you're submitting it. So just do the best you can, complete it to the best extent possible, and then revise and resubmit the form when you have more information available. And it should be submitted as part of the pre-construction meeting. Next slide. So this is in the TCAP manual again. So the asbestos abatement procedure is pretty detailed on the things that you need to do. And also highlighted there is our asbestos specification, which is 028233. That's been updated, I think, within the last couple of years. So again, not too recent, but just to note that there had been a change. But within that specification, there's line by line details on how to deal with an asbestos abatement project. And there's also an Appendix A that will be mentioned later in the next segment of the training that gives you kind of a checklist or a list of all the things that you need to do in the field. Also want to point out that it is a regulatory requirement that you have to hire a project monitor, and that project monitor has to be independent of the contractor. So, for example, the asbestos abatement contractor can't hire the third-party monitor to watch their work because there's a conflict of interest there. So it has to be a separate third-party entity. Next slide. So just to recap a little bit on the asbestos abatement drawings, they need to be signed by a PE, and have a table listing your work area, the phasing of the work, the type of ACM and the quantity, the abatement method that you're proposing, and the regulatory citation, the floor plan and building profile, the asbestos abatement work area limits clearly identified on the drawing, where your decon unit is going to be, where your negative air unit is going to be located, and have those calculations for the air changes, where the waste container is going to be located, and then show the haul route from the work area to the waste container, where the emergency exit is, and utility source. Where are you going to get power from? Where are you going to get water from? Are you going to discharge any water from your decon, or is it going to be self-contained and taken off-site? Things like that, so we have an idea what the whole picture is. Next slide. Asbestos abatement specification requirements. So I mentioned our spec, the 028233. Highly recommend using this as a guidance document because it lays out everything you need to know per the regulations and per PA standards. So per the TCAP manual, your removal specifications have to include detailed work procedures for the removal and disposal of each type of asbestos-containing material. And again, the contract documents have to identify all the areas and quantify and the location, all your containment details, decon, everything that we talked about previously. Next slide. Some helpful documents. So what are the documents that would help you all in preparing these applications? Basically, making sure you have the completed PA 3677 with all the required signatures. So again, if you're using an existing survey or you have a survey that you're referencing, have that the licensed asbestos person signing off on that form, and then also including the survey with the submittal, the survey report with the lab and inspector certifications, like I just mentioned, your abatement drawings being signed by a licensed PE and the asbestos project designer, and have that asbestos removal spec. Next slide. things to keep in mind. So, the reason we're doing all this is we don't want to have delays with our project. So it's best to identify up front if there's any asbestos or hazardous materials, get them abated, and then you can go about your work. Finding something in the middle of a project's never helpful to the bottom line. And making sure, again, like a broken record here, but drawings and specs signed by a PE and the asbestos project designer. Okay, on to the environmental management plan. So again, the EMPs are reviewed by my group. And again, I am Jennifer Wooten, and I work in the environmental engineering group. So the EMP, much like all of our other forms and documents, is required so that we can ensure that the work complies with all the local, state, and federal regulations. So most projects in New York will require review of regulations, mostly administered by DEC, but there are other entities that could play a part. And in New Jersey, most of the regulations that are applicable are from the New Jersey DEP. So basically, there was a TCAP bulletin that was put out in 2022 that's related to the EMP, and it's a comprehensive guidance document. Highly recommend taking a look at this. And when you have a project, if you don't think that you need an EMP, then you fill out the flow chart on the left, and it helps guide you through to that decision. And then the architect or the engineer of record will sign off on this form and submit it with the package. If you do have an EMP, then you should also fill out the form on the right that is basically an outline of the table of contents and checking which things are applicable to your project, and then what page in the document might we find the information about that. Next slide. So the EMP outline, what we like to see is basically following to a T what is in that TCAP guidance bulletin that came out in 2022, and just set up your document exactly with the flow that we have in that included in that bulletin. So your table of contents should just have every single section as prescribed. And then if something doesn't apply to your project, like let's say you're doing borings, soil borings, right? So most of the things in there aren't going to apply, but maybe 2 or 3 sections, which we'll get into in a little bit, will apply. So then you go through and you just detail what you're doing. Even if it's a small scale thing, when you're doing something like soil borings, you are probably going to generate some kind of waste. You might have some kind of decon material that you have to wash off the drill rig, or you have some waste drums from drill cuttings and fluids. So there's still, even if you're putting materials back into the hole, you still might have a couple drums of waste. So we just want to know, what is the plan? Where will that be stored? Will it be stored in drums? Will it be stored in a vac truck and hauled away immediately? What facility are you using, if you know that, to haul and to dispose of the waste? Those kinds of things give a comprehensive picture on what's happening. Other environmental issues that you may have that aren't in our table of contents, if there's something missing, just add a section or a subsection and include it in the plan. And the person preparing the plan should be an environmental professional who has at least 5 years of experience and practices in the state for which the work is done. So if all their experience is in New York, but your project's in New Jersey, it's probably not appropriate. They may not be familiar with all the New Jersey requirements. And then besides the environmental professional signing the plan, we also need the architect or engineer of record to sign off on the cover page. Next slide. So this is the EMP table of contents that I mentioned, and we'll touch on each of these things kind of at a high level, talk a little bit about some of the items that are highlighted in red. And then, as I mentioned, for the next webinar, we're going to deep dive into the soil erosion and sediment control methods and procedures, also the management of excavated material, dewatering, and backfilling. Next slide. So if you're doing a building renovation and you have lead paint, Like I mentioned previously, we follow OSHA's lead and construction standard. And so we're not really differentiating between lead-based paint versus lead containing. We're just saying any existing painted surface contains lead. Most projects aren't going to require a full lead abatement under the OSHA guidelines. It would be more like the incidental lead or spot removal. And we have specifications and procedures that can help guide on what's needed for that. But it's basically OSHA's lead in construction standard and worker protection. Next slide. Okay, so I'm kind of repeating myself here, but basically these are the notes that you might see on your drawings, basically letting everybody know that, that you should assume that the paint contains lead. And if there is no paint removal on the contract, you may have incidental disturbance where you have a spot here or there, and in which case you follow OSHA's lead in construction standard. Next slide. All right, site work, soil erosion and sediment control. So this is high level. We're going to deep dive into this with the next webinar. But basically, if you have any kind of site work where you're disturbing the ground, then you need soil erosion and sediment control measures outlined in your EMP. So again, if you're doing borings, you don't need a huge comprehensive plan, but if you're gonna be near a storm drain or near something that'll discharge to a waterway, you just want to show, yes, we can protect that, or no, we're not going to have any impact, we're far away from everything. So just a mention of any kind of soil erosion and sediment control. Basically, some of the notes that are referenced in the TCAP manual that you'll see, that in New Jersey, if you're disturbing anything greater than 5,000 square feet, you have to work with the local soil conservation district and get the soil erosion and sediment control plan certified through them. And if you're in New York and you're disturbing more than 1 acre, then you have to work with New York State DEC. And all projects, regardless of size, require stormwater pollution prevention plan as part of the EMP. Excavated soil. So all soil on PA facilities is considered historic fill. It is not clean fill. You can reuse material that from the site that you're working at as backfill, provided that it's not contaminated, based on visual inspection, making sure there's no staining or any kind of odors, anything that smells like petroleum or other chemicals. That material would have to be pushed off to the side and sampled and disposed of off-site. If you have any excess soil, then it should be considered contaminated and not clean fill, and it must be sampled. And then we need to know what facility you're sending it to, who the hauler is going to be. And we do not allow soil from our facilities to go to facilities that only accept clean fill. So a lot of the Part 360 recyclers in New York can only accept clean fill, so those aren't appropriate. And we also don't allow our soil to go to New Jersey sites managed by an LSRP. Next slide. Dewatering. So depending on the job that you're doing, the height of the water table, all of those things, you may need to do dewatering. This is just a high level of what you might see as a comment or in the notes, but in the EMP, you should talk about like what kind of dewatering are you doing? Are you collecting fluids in a tank and sending it off site? Are you allowing it to infiltrate back into the site but away from the work that you're doing? Is there a contingency plan for petroleum contaminated groundwater if you happen to encounter it? How are you going to stop pumping and deal with that? So dewatering operations can't discharge to the storm sewer without approval or a permit. And some facilities have existing speedies permits or NJPDES permits, or in New York, you have to work with DEP to go into their sewers. So definitely requires approval from outside agencies and coordination. And if you're dewatering more than 100,000 gallons a day in New Jersey or 45 gallons per minute in New York, you require coordination with the states and getting a permit. backfilling. So when you excavate, and if you're not able to reuse the material on site, then you may require to bring in fill to the site. So if that's the case, then we're going to need to know the name of the site that you're getting the material from, the address, the phone number of the supplier, a certification from them that it's clean, and a soil sample, at least one for every 5,000 cubic yards. And all of this should happen before the material comes to the site. Permits. So a lot of times I'll see EMPs that say, oh, no permits are required, but then the project will be in New Jersey and it'll be in a flood hazard area. So you want to really make sure that you understand all the permits that could be out there. This is just an example, and again, the EMP bulletin has a lot of examples in there. Also, there's a link in the TCAP manual to a permits section that gives you an idea of all kinds of permits that could be out there, both for New York and New Jersey. But in New Jersey, if you're within 500 feet of a water body, you might require a waterfront development permit. Also in New Jersey, the flood hazard area that I mentioned, if you're in a floodplain, certain dewatering, like we talked about, may need permits. Definitely, if you're near a wetland in either state, you could require a permit. And like I mentioned, the soil erosion and sediment control, if you're disturbing more than 5,000 square feet in New Jersey or an acre in New York. The spill contingency plan. So we want to see that you have a spill contingency plan if you're storing chemicals or petroleum products. And, even if you're doing borings and you have a hydraulic rig and a hose burst, you should have a spill plan as part of that work, even if it's just very basic, saying, hey, this is what we're going to have on site. It'll be a spill kit, and we'll put it next to the rig, and here's the closest drain, and this is how we'll make sure that nothing goes down the drain. And basically, step by step, what you would do in the event that something goes wrong. And also, accounting for equipment decontamination if you did have a spill and you needed to do that on site. An SPCC plan, which is a federal requirement, is required to store fuel or oil in tanks with a capacity greater than 1320 gallons. So that's just something to keep in mind too, if you have, for whatever reason, the need to store large amounts of fuel or oil. Areas of environmental concern. So this is something, again, people will say, oh, no, there's nothing to worry about here. But this is pre-existing stuff. So you have to do a little due diligence, take a look at the site. Are there any historical spills in the area? Was it a former hazardous waste site or a chemical storage site? And the DEP in New Jersey and the DEC in New York, they have websites where you can type in the address and try to find, some of this information, and also, get the information before you submit the EMP, and before you're doing your work, you should know kind of what you're getting into if you're going to be digging, etc. We want to know about training procedures. So things specific to your project. Will your workers have HAZWOPER training if we're working on a contaminated site? What kind of OSHA training will they have? If they're disturbing incidental lead, then they need that lead training. We want to know with your documentation, what kinds of documents and reports will be needed for the project? Where will all that stuff be located? How can we access it? And then additional site activities as required. Do you need dust control? Will there be additional air monitoring of the perimeter? What kind of security measures will you have in place? Those kinds of things. So common errors or issues, not providing an EMP. So the plan is always required when there's site work or large scale demolition. And again, that flow chart is super helpful, should guide you whether or not you need it. And you should always use that EMP outline and respond to each topic. And if something doesn't apply to your project, just put not applicable and move on to the next section. And the EMP should be prepared by an experienced environmental consultant, somebody who has expertise in the state that the work is. And asbestos surveys always require the certified professional to perform the survey and prepare the report. So keys to success, again, get a qualified person to put your EMP together, and the majority of the plan, especially items requiring a permit, should be prepared as part of the TAA application. That'll save you time identifying these permits up front and making sure that you have everything you need before you go to do the work. Items requiring submission by the tenant's contractor upon award of the project should be identified in your pre-construction meeting, and a schedule of submission should be requested, and such items may require approval prior to the start of the work. So our group will support the REO's office to review and approve these submittals.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And with this, we'll pass it over to the REOs and the EFO, Environmental Field Ops, and our Resident Engineer's Office.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Daniel with the Resident Engineer's Office. I'm here with Carmela, my resident engineer. You can go to the next slide, please. We'll kick it off with the Resident Engineer's Office roles and responsibilities. So who are we? Resident Engineer's Office is the primary Port Authority point of contact for the tenant team from pre-construction all the way to closeout. We coordinate between the tenant team and the Port Authority facility and various PA groups for all construction activities, inspections, and tests. And our goal is to lead the tenant team to a successful project closeout. We do this through our responsibilities, which includes auditing and monitoring the tenant's contractor and design professional to ensure that they're conforming with the PA-approved contract drawings, specs, permits, applicable codes, and making sure that they're adhering to all TCAP procedures. We will attend and coordinate with the various PA groups to witness and attend ongoing construction, inspections, and tests. The REO will verify in the field that all work being requested for an inspection by the AEOR is complete prior to scheduling an inspection. We'll coordinate and schedule those inspections, and at the end of each inspection, we will issue official meeting minutes noting any inspection comments that were generated. And at the end of the TAA, we'll process all required documentation to request a permit.
Thank you, Dan. Let me also introduce Kathy McAdams. She is part of the Environmental Field Operations Office. We work in concert. We're under the umbrella of our Construction Management Division of Engineering Department. So you'll see us go back and forth with roles and responsibilities and how they support the effort in this TAA for these very specific environmental activities. So I'll pass the next slide over to Kathy.
Thank you, Carmela. I am the engineer of construction who is in charge of the Environmental Field Operations Group. The EFO is the Environmental Field Support Group within the Construction Management Division, and we have various offices located throughout the Port Authority. For example, LaGuardia, Kennedy, Newark. We review the submittals and audit asbestos, lead, soils, and other environmental activities from pre-construction through construction through closeout and completion. We mainly look at the field issues, not constructability, and we leave the technical issues themselves to the environmental design division. Next. Okay, so the basic reviewing is that the TAA the review is to determine the environmental impacts on the construction or demolition projects. The documents are to be submitted prior to construction and if needed throughout the construction stages. They're reviewed initially at the initial application, during design and construction phases, and at the closeout and completion of the project. I must note here that the generator of the environmental waste must be noted prior to any pre-construction meeting. And it is also preferred that the abatement contractor is submitted prior to the meeting. If necessary, and we have had at times a separate pre-construction meeting to discuss the abatement portion of the project. Next. Okay, all the reviews are referenced for conformance to applicable federal, state, and local environmental regulations and PA specifications. All the regulations and standards are referenced in the specifications and the tenant construction review manual. The disposition of review comments and discrepancies with specific notes and regulatory references are submitted to the tenant coordinator, whoever you're submitting your submittals to. The tenant is responsible for the hiring of an independent environmental project monitoring firm who is accountable for all of the abatement activities. No work can commence without proper notifications to the appropriate regulatory agencies such as the DOL, EPA, DEC. So no work will start until all the notifications have been made. Next. Okay, the tenants are required to survey the proposed project area for the presence of asbestos and other hazmats, such as PCBs, using a firm or licensed individual by the New York State Department of Labor or the New Jersey Department of Community Affairs, as was discussed previously. Once the survey is complete, the tenant submits the results and the PA 3677 paperwork in advance to the contract document submittal. If asbestos-containing material is found, the abatement work must be performed prior to any construction or any alteration activity. Next. Carmela?
Yes, so we'll be moving on to the design phase 1 stage of the TCAP process. So the tenant and the AUR to conduct a site visit, as Kathy mentioned. This is critical to identify the presence of any hazardous material, as it's critical that all abatement work must be completed prior to any other construction or alteration activity. And in addition, we want to identify any other existing conditions that can affect construction later
Are you
on,
in this meeting?
which could include obstructions in the field, identification of existing utilities, tying locations, and any exposure to the elements. The REO will review contract drawings for constructability and also to get an understanding of the scope of work. So for hazardous, in the context of hazardous material work, we want to understand the phasing plan. If you plan to do an abatement in one shot, or if you're going to break it up into several zones, we want to understand what are your containment methods, the location of any decontamination units. We want to understand the full scope of work, so a schedule of all the material to be abated. We want to understand, we want to see that the drawings are coordinated between disciplines. So if there's any demolition that has to take place, we want to know that the abatement is called out for in those areas and it's completed prior to beginning that work. And all required special inspections are to be listed on the drawings. The REO will monitor all design comments until they're resolved to ensure that they're implemented in the field.
I also want to emphasize that while there's abatement work going on, whether it's asbestos removal, the restoration is also being looked upon too. So if you're removing pipe insulation or fireproofing or disturbing some areas, what is the interim fix? Are you re-fireproofing? What is your restoration? So we'd want to see those on the drawings, and that would help support what Kathy would be looking for with her team. So we're looking in concert together to make sure that the full scope of work is captured, so that at the time of the reinspection for occupancy, we've put all those check boxes in those check marks in those boxes to make sure we've covered them all.
Yeah, so we look for a thorough design, and the goal during the design stage is to receive a full design approval or NFC prior to the pre-construction meeting. Next slide, please. We'll talk about phase 2 or construction. So a pre-construction meeting can be scheduled once all the pre-con documents have been approved and the design reaches at a minimum conditional approval, although full approval is the goal. And at this point of the project, we should have an abatement contractor identified, as there's certain pre-con submittals that are required. For example, the HASP, which should contain activity-specific, which should outline any activity-specific hazards and whether that's related to lead abatement or asbestos abatement, that'll be included in the HASP. At the pre-con, we'll discuss any open design comments and go over all the pre-con documents, which would include the MWBE plan, contractor certificate of insurance, security plans, we'll go over the general contractor's detailed schedule, which should include any special inspections with the AUR, any inspections with Port Authority, any critical dates, milestones, go live dates. We'll go over the phasing of the work and any operational requirements, which can include site safety, permits, whether that's hot works, confined space, or hydrant use. We'll go over the AEUR and contractor responsibilities. And I just want to emphasize that the architect or engineer of record is responsible for 100% of the work and inspections. So at the pre-con meeting, we ask that the AUR do a page turn, go over the scope of work, identifying any critical elements of construction, going over their strategy to ensure that all special inspections are performed as required, and what that coordination effort would look like with the contractor, with the resident engineer's office, to make sure that the REO is given ample notice to be able to coordinate with and attend those special inspections. We want to make sure that any special inspections that are performed are being done by individuals and agencies that are approved and certified or qualified to perform that special inspection. We should be receiving, the REO should be receiving copies of signed and sealed special inspection reports as they're performed and completed, so that we can review it as the project progresses. And of course, the AUR should be discussing any envisioned phased occupancy, which should be identified in an approved phasing plan. And again, I just want to emphasize, it's the AUR who's responsible for the work and the inspections. The REO and the EFO is just there to audit and monitor the work for conformance.
Special emphasis on the special inspections agencies. What we do is actually go into the building information system to confirm that the agencies are registered with an applicable special inspection agency. We want to make sure there's no conflicts of interest with the special inspection agency, and whether it's the designer or the contractor, it should be separate and isolated. It should be independent. So this is a conversation that needs to be, taking place at the pre-con. So just be prepared when we ask these questions.
Thank you. And moving on to construction. So the architect or engineer of record is expected to ensure that all elements of work are complete and in conformance with the approved documents prior to requesting an inspection. The REO role is just to monitor and audit the work, which could include attending special inspections and tests. And the contractor is to provide the REO with ample notice to allow us to attend and witness those inspections. The REO will verify that all materials used on site match the PA approved drawings, and REO will ensure that all work is complete prior to scheduling an official Port Authority inspection.
And I'll turn this over to Kathy once again. She'll be adding in the abatement submittals that are required prior to any start of abatement work. Kathy?
Okay, depending on the results of the environmental survey, a separate TAA may be required for abatement. And many times we do have a separate TAA or a separate portion of a TAA. Requirements from the section, asbestos section 028233 are to be submitted prior to or be on hand at the pre-con. What needs to be included would be a copy of the asbestos contractor's license, which has been issued by local state agency or and the certificates of supervisors and workers. Copy of a valid asbestos handling license for the independent project monitoring and air monitoring firms. Copy of valid asbestos handling license for third-party laboratories. Copy of transporters permits, licenses, certifications, municipal, state, federal permits and licenses to operate a landfill, the work area and site procedures, if they have been amended from the approved design documents, a construction critical path method bar graph to indicate all abatement activities and regulatory inspections, and copies of federal and state notifications, such as the notifications and copies of the project specific variances, if they're applicable. Next. Okay, pre-abatement and submittal requirements. The subjects of importance are the HASP is required to include an environmental handling plan for all hazardous materials. The EFO is available to assist the contractors to clarify the submittal documentation. We're right at whatever facility you're working at, and we're more than willing to work with you. The tenant is the generator of all the waste and supplies their own legal manifest for transportation and disposal of the waste. And no Port Authority manifest will be generated for this unless it's determined by other agreements. Generally, it states in the lease agreement who the generator of the waste is. Next. Okay, the tenant's environmental monitoring firm is responsible for all the inspections, air sampling, and laboratory analysis. The EFO audits, and we will do periodic checks on it. The environmental field operations conducts physical audits for abatement and remediation activities of asbestos and lead, and review of required on-site documentations and activities for compliance with the approved design regulations and specifications. If there are any issues, if there's an immediate issue, we will report directly to the contractor who is on site and stop the work. Otherwise, the inspection findings are reported to the contractor project manager and generally the REO representative, who will then intervene. Next. Okay, the frequency of the audits are performed periodically and or on an as-needed basis, which is determined, among other things, with the experience of the contractor and the third-party monitoring. The EFO will conduct a final audit of the areas and of the documents submitted by the tenant and will notify the REO that they have reviewed them with no further comments via a completion memo. Subsequent to the Port Authority's final memo, the tenant's environmental monitoring firm will submit a completion memo to the Port Authority. And both of these memos become part of the REO's closeout package and the issuance of a PTO. And the next slide will show the memo that the environmental tenant monitoring firm has to submit. This is all in the TCAP manual. Okay, next. Some issues and errors that we frequently come up with are incomplete packages, non-compliance or misapplication of the current regulations and federal and state and local guidelines. A lot of times we come into illegible or expired documents. References to and from other projects, meaning you may submit a Department of Buildings paperwork for a Port Authority job, which is not acceptable. Changing the project team midstream is encountered more than you would think. Timely submission of a letter of completion for the issuance of the permit to occupy. The number Form 3678 must be submitted with the initial submittal, and making scope changes without approval will often hold up a job. Next. Carmela?
Yeah, so we're just going to go over some of the typical deficiencies that are commonly found in the field related to environmental work. So first and foremost, once we have all the approved documents and submittals in place, it's critical that all work is installed per those approved documents and following all those related plans. So some of the deficiencies that we typically find is the contractor not providing equipment that's shown in the approved drawings or submittals. The EOR is to provide approved submittal noting the make and model and all the details of the equipment. If the work is complete per the approved drawing, but we find in the final field audit that there's still additional abatement that is required because maybe it wasn't captured on the approved drawings.
And also to add that possibly the method of removal has changed from what was approved on the drawings also presents an issue when it comes to the acceptance of the work. So let's be mindful of, seeing how it was submitted, how the drawings got approved, and making sure that we advise and communicate these changes to the REO and EFO office so that we could guide you in the proper way of making that scope change submittal.
That's correct. At a final inspection or field audit, we want to make sure that the work site is clean prior to that official inspection. So all construction debris and material should be removed prior to the inspection. The contractor, sometimes we see them not working in accordance with the design specifications and regulations. This is critical. Or if the contractor or consultant is not knowledgeable or disregarding the Code Rule 56 for New York State or for New Jersey, the Subchapter 8 regulations, also EPA, OSHA, etc. Making sure we're following all of the required regulations. Next slide, please. We're going to go over field conditions and scope changes, whether that's adding or removing work scope. The field conditions should be captured ideally during the design phase field visit. Should something change in the field during construction, the AUR is to immediately notify the resident engineer's office, and the resident engineer will determine the best path to capture those conditions, whether that's through an official scope change or updating the as-built. And the resident engineer will make that determination based on any impacts to fire, life safety, or code-related issues. Next slide, please. Okay, moving on to certification requests or inspections, which is phase 3 of the TCAP process. Inspections are scheduled by the resident engineer's office through receipt of official signed and sealed AEOR certification request packages. They must be reviewed and approved by the resident engineer's office prior to scheduling an inspection, and we will not schedule any inspections on scopes of work with open design comments, which is why it's very critical that we receive a full design approval as early as possible. We require that during an inspection, an AEOR, a representative who's knowledgeable of the scope of work, be present during the inspection, along with any contractor personnel or subcontractors that are required to perform the inspection, which could include providing access to an area or demonstrating any tests that are required for the inspection. At the conclusion of each inspection, REO will issue inspection minutes noting any comments generated during the inspection. Next slide, please. So the AEOR certification request package consists of the following. It's a cover letter from the AEOR saying that the work is complete, whether that's for a partial or a final inspection, a PH 212 or a 314. If it's a partial inspection, oftentimes it'll be accompanied with a sketch if it's applicable. Each sketch should include a unique sketch number. It should have the TAA number and title. It should be dated with a legend identifying the area being certified, and it should be signed and sealed by a design professional. We also look for the special inspections checklist and any applicable special inspection reports. For a final inspection or certification request package, we require record drawings. As-built are to be reviewed with the REO prior to submitting any record drawings. And for environmental related closeout documents, would include the AUR abatement completion letter, abatement contract reports, and third-party air monitor reports.
And a sample of this completion letter was shown earlier on by Kathy. So if you have any questions, you could, again, relook at these slides and speak with Kathy to help you compile that completion letter when the time
Yes.
is for occupancy.
And on the next slide, I'll kick it back to EFO, who's going to go over some of the helpful documents throughout construction.
Okay, there's many documents out there that will assist the EOR consultants and contractors. Use the checklists that are in Appendix A of the specifications, okay? They will tell you everything that you need to submit and do. These design specifications have to be customized to project-specific requirements. Must provide all the documentation prior to a final visual audit, which is the air sample clearance reports, copies of waste shipping documentation, supervisor's narratives, sampling logs of OSHA testing. And again, we're auditing this, okay? We're not going to look at everything, but we will spot check and make sure everything is in compliance. Issue advanced timely notice of the schedule for inspections. And if you're a new contractor or a consultant, use the asbestos pre-qualification approval checklist. Next. Okay, some key takeaways. We encourage open communication and collaboration between everybody. Okay, we're always available to assist you however we can. You must understand the relations and the agreements between the Port Authority and the tenants. With the lease agreements, who is the generator of the waste? We need timely updates for inspection requests and changes in the work schedule. We need the designer or the engineer of record to sign off on changes throughout the project, or the work could potentially be stopped, okay? Attend the kickoff meetings, the pre-cons, the progress meetings, okay? That's where we can discuss everything. And attendance at site visits is crucial. Next.
Yeah,
Carmel.
Aria is going to go over some final talking points and key takeaways for success. Again, we're going to reemphasize the importance of striving for a full design approval as soon as possible to avoid any delays in scheduling inspection. We recommend that the engineer of record performs an on-site walkthrough as the design is under review to capture all the work scope, and as construction is ongoing, they should be on-site as often as possible. Communication is the key to success, keeping the REO informed of all field issues and scope changes. The EOR and general contractors to coordinate with the REO in advance to attend any pre-inspections. This is key to a successful outcome during official Port Authority audit inspections. Planning ahead, general contractor to provide 2-week look-aheads and advance notice for upcoming tenant milestones, tests, inspections. And we recommend that the architect or engineer of record submit draft certification requests to allow REO to review in advance, which will expedite the inspection certification package approval process. And after an inspection, we recommend addressing all inspection comments in a timely manner. We recommend a maximum 2-week timeframe to abate all items. And the EORs to confirm and issue official re-inspection requests. And with that, I'll kick it back to Ryan to continue the presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And we can pause the recording here. We've come to the end of the presentation. And we do have some questions from our